Last night, protesters threw stones at the municipality in the town of Shahin Shah, one of dozens of demonstrations across Iran. In unverified footage from what looks like a clinic, the voiceover says 10 people were shot. 2 may have been killed. Death to the dictator, they chanted in Tehran, a direct reference to Iran's supreme leader, who today blamed foreign enemies for the protests. The government spokesman later named Britain, the US and Saudi Arabia.
The
enemy is waiting for an opportunity, for a crack through which it can infiltrate. Look at the recent days' incidents. All those who are at odds with the Islamic Republic have utilised various means, including money, weapons, politics and intelligence apparatus, to create problems for the Islamic system, the Islamic Republic and the Islamic Revolution.
The protests began in Mashhad last Thursday and rapidly spread not just to big cities like Isfahan, Bandar Abbas and the capital Tehran, but more unusually to smaller centres all across the country and to outlying towns and villages. At first, people were protesting about the government's failure to relieve poverty.
It's unemployment, exhaustion and lies, the deceiving of the people.
I have 3 children. They're doctors and engineers in this community. All 3 are unemployed.
My husband is 75 years old and he still has to sell clothes, and they keep moving him on.
When you live below the poverty line, these things happen. With the pressure on people mounting, events like this are inevitable.
In the last 2 days, the protests have become more political, people raging against the mullahs and the huge sums of money they absorb from the exchequer.
You're seeing, protests starting off about bread and butter issues, about economic issues, about the degree of corruption, to going into much more radical slogans calling for the downfall of the entire Islamic Republic. We've seen slogans of down with the dictator. So these slogans have become radicalized with each day going on, and also the protests themselves have taken a much more violent nature.
They're also angry that Iranian Revolutionary Guards are in Syria. Money, they say, is being spent on foreign wars rather than on problems back home. President Rouhani won 2 elections by promising Iranians that their lives would improve once he'd agreed to restrict the country's nuclear program in return for the lifting of sanctions. But although the economy is growing, few people have yet felt the benefit. The protesters are largely working class, many of them unemployed young men. The president says they have the right to protest peacefully and he'll address their concerns. But the security forces are using tear gas and in some places live fire. And the fear now is that the Revolutionary Guard will be deployed and use more force to crush all dissent.
Joining me is the Iranian-American author Azadeh Moaveni and the British-Iranian journalist Ramita Navai. Ramita Navai, you've written a very celebrated book about what it is like to be working class, jobless, whatever, in South Tehran in particular. But it's a very good snapshot of what we're talking about. Now, who are these people? What lives do they lead?
First of all, I think it's important to say that we don't know exactly who these people are, but the reports we're getting is that these protesters are, as you said, the working class who traditionally supported the revolution. They were an important, integral part of the revolution. They're seen as pro-regime. However, what I found and what we know from reporting there is that Iran is such a complex society that you can have religious, traditional, working class Iranian, for example, who believes in a separation between state and religion, or, for example, who doesn't support the regime. I think what's extraordinary about these protests and what's happening is, first of all, I don't think they have erupted from nowhere. We've seen that these working class traditional Iranians have been protesting in the last year, but there have been small, sporadic protests throughout the country, but also that this big working class that you're talking about, and middle class, lower middle class, there's a big youth population. An Iranian official said that he thinks half of all these protesters are under the age of 25, and among that age group, youth unemployment is extremely high, about 25% officially.
But this isn't, as some people have said, it is not another revolution as yet. The upper middle classes and the rich, and certainly when I was there in May, were actually much happier than I'd ever met them since the revolution. So this is a very divided situation.
Yeah, we have to be really careful to use the term revolution. Iranians, as you can imagine, are very scared of revolution, scared of bloodshed, scared after what happened in 2009, of what's happening in Syria and all around them, very anti-outside intervention. But this uprising is significant because of the sheer numbers and the provinces and how widespread it is throughout the country.
Well, Azadeh, the bigger picture is the overall condition of the country. Well, economic growth is rather strong, but it's not leaking down to the poor. What's your reading?
I think we have to remember that Rouhani inherited an Iran that had 8 years of Ahmadinejad, so populist subsidies, a completely tanked economy. So he's worked really hard. He got inflation down from something astronomical, like 40%, down to hovering around 10. But a lot of his reforms, I think there are two things. One, they're blocked by Iran's internal kind of bottleneck in the system. It's a divided system. There's powerful clerical security establishment that doesn't see, it's not necessarily on board with these reforms. And then significantly, there is the outside world. So Rouhani promised, huge job creation. Part of his selling of the nuclear deal to the Iranian public was that everyone would see their quality of life improve. But in fact, the sanctions relief and the integration of Iran into the global economy, specifically the banking sector, that was meant to accompany that has not happened. There's been...
Frustrated largely by the Americans.
Frustrated, indeed. And so I think that right now, there's cackling in the White House that Iran may be imploding and the regime is vulnerable and going to fall. But indeed, it's the foot dragging on all of these important issues that would have helped the foreign investment come into the economy that Rouhani would have needed to actually be able to trickle down to these young people we're seeing in the street.
But as we know from his Twitter feed, Trump deals in crudities. What he probably doesn't understand is the extent to which Rouhani is a man in the middle. I mean, he has the Revolutionary Guard behind, who he has actually himself begun to bear down on. And that has obviously met with great hostility from them. And then he's got the people on the streets who are starving.
Absolutely. But I think it's important to bear in mind, I think the images are arresting. They're heartbreaking. I think Iranian society at large has great sympathy for the grievances of these young people. And even the middle class, is impacted by the state of the economy. But I think that these protests are small. We have not seen any that seem to have gathered more than a couple of hundred people. I don't think it's necessarily reflective of mainstream public opinion about the direction the country should go, about Iran's interventions in the region. Many people feel like Rouhani, and in fact, these interventions are keeping Iran safe in a very hostile region. So I think that, Iran is eternally very divided over many of these things.
What's your sense of what will happen?
God, I think Iran is one of those exciting places because it's impossible to predict. Nobody predicted 2009. I fear that, as we saw in 2009, these protests will be crushed. I do think these protests are far more significant than the protests in 2009. And I think that's because you have had members of workers' unions, labour's unions, speak out and say, this is also our movement, this is also our problem. And it is a financial problem, and that could be the light.
And the context is of a country which actually is extraordinarily developed, far more developed than most of its equivalent-sized nations. There are, far more developed in some ways than Saudi Arabia in terms of what's happened to education and all the rest of it, rights even of women.
Absolutely. And, there are so many avenues. And I think when Rouhani said we must embrace and accept the culture of protest, it was recognizing exactly this. There are city council elections, there are parliamentary elections. There are many ways, if the regime, the government actually is how people see it, were to open up, there are avenues to express and articulate these demands in a way that is not so potentially incendiary.
And the inevitable British question, which is Nazanin Radcliffe. What I mean, this certainly doesn't have her released from prison at all quickly, does it?
I think
it's hard to think the regime is going to be much bothered with that with this in.
No, I think that her fate and the general tremulousness and moment of trepidation will all be kind of wrapped up together. I think the slowness of any response shows that the system is still formulating how it's going to respond.